Applause. Open. Okay, one in the corner there. We usually take about 3 questions together and then we'll put something in. So
we will just ask the speaker if they can come and ask their question at a mic because it is recorded. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Hi, can you guys hear me? Okay. Hi, my name is Kal Chan. I'm a PhD student at Princeton, doing some research here in India. Thank you very much for your talk. I just have one question about measurement. And I just was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about some of the challenges and maybe some of the current practices that have to do with measuring urbanization and measuring urban populations, especially given the phenomenon that you alluded to earlier of circulatory migration. So I focus on China, actually, and this is also a huge issue in terms of measurement because you have this question of, if you look at the official government statistics in China, if you look at just official registered urban residents, it's completely different from the sort of true population, given that you do have people who move to the city for, say, 10 years and then come back to their original sort of family land area. So I just wondered if you could comment a little bit on that. Thank you.
yeah, again, the measurement issue in terms of definitions is, and let me go over it very briefly. In India, we have 3 criteria for recognizing an urban area, which is population size, population density, and the proportion of males in agriculture. So these 3 criteria are used. Most other countries have 2 criteria, or some have even 1 criterion. Now, on the basis of this, we measure our urban population. If we drop any one of these criteria, the Indian urbanization rate actually goes up from 32%. It will go up to about 40%, or if I go to a single criterion, can go up to as high as 70%, simply because we are a densely populated country. Now, when we are talking about circular migration by its nature you can look at it in 2 ways. One is that circular migration is capturing a lot of temporary migration, which we have a lot of in India, the seasonal migration that's taking place. But the way we actually capture the data in India, which is through the census, is that we are actually looking for people who are settled. And then circulatory migration then becomes a generational thing. It's a life cycle problem. Now, if you think about it, if you're talking about an accelerating process of migration, you have relatively few people coming in at the beginning, larger number of new migrants coming at the end. So, even if there's circulatory migration, the migration pattern will continue to accelerate. In India, what's happening is that the 2 seem to be balancing each other out a little bit. And they're roughly equal, they're growing at roughly the same rate, which is again a reflection of the fact at no point did our in-migration actually accelerate. Come here. We just take the ones from the back with the microphone.
Thank you for your informative talk. My name is Jitendra. I just want to understand whether that figure of 20%, can we safely assume that includes all kinds of workers? I mean, even the rickshawalas and in the unorganized sector. So are all those included in this figure of 20% migration? Okay. And second thing is about the research on migrating alone without the family. I mean, is there any correlation? Do we have any idea about the dependence on the per capita income of those people, or their wages, and the years since migration?
Very little, because you see, in the surveys, we do not have income. We only have expenditure estimates. Okay, and the expenditure estimates are actually quite fascinating, which is that recent migrants, which is migrants who have come in over the last 2 years, tend to have much higher expenditure levels than migrants who have been there for longer and from the settled residents. So what happens is the expenditure pattern, so if I draw the length that they have been here, high, and then it sort of drops down to the average of urban India. So basically what seems to be happening is that migrants bring a bit of their capital from their villages and spend it up front in establishing themselves. And then they gradually slide down to the average for urban India. Okay? So we don't know about incomes per se. We only know about wage rates.
You have dealt with the migration part, which has naturally taken place in the last century. Now the question is, we have to think of...
You just speak into the microphone. Speak into the microphone, please.
Is it okay now? So the question is, we have three conditions. Number one, the population, which is likely to be about 1,600 million by 2050, as suggested by many people. Number two, in our country, land and water are limited, and therefore we have to stick to that and see how we can reuse and all those things, and how many people can be supported. At present, the agriculture sector gives about 15% to the GDP, at present 15 to 16, while the services sector gives almost 55 to 60%. And in order to begin the livelihood, which was mainly in the last century based on agriculture land and agriculture vocation, has to change to services where less land and water will be used by the population and the other activities. So therefore, our way of migration should be planned, not allowed by its own speed. That is what China did. They decided that they wanted to have industrialization at a fast rate. So they built not slums, but regular buildings, shifted people, provided all the socio-economic activities there for them to do the work, and also live not very differently from the urban, but in a small area, small towns, not in much bigger one. So similarly, if we really want to have a growth, we will have to think how to plan the migration from the rural to this area. Now in this case, as worked out, I actually saw in 1975, we found out how much of land and water is required for agriculture and other things, and I projected it for 50 years, that is up to 2000 and 2050. Up to 2000 it almost tallied because the same situation continued. But from 2000 onwards, now the things have totally changed because the population has increased, industries has increased, the skills have come in, and in those ways things much more growth is coming up. So therefore we have to do a replanning of the migration and not leave it to them on a natural basis, and that is what is lacking at present. By coming in, bringing in skills, agriculture people have to be taken care of, but they cannot support. The land under crop, 142 or 140 million hectares, is still the same for the past 50 years. Only thing is that the intensity of irrigation and intensity of cropping has increased. So that has provided us all the food that we need at present. And in future also it can be done. But there is a lot of waste and other things which are not being done, like water harvesting, like now we have the skill of the solar energy, which can give much more jobs etc., and create activities in the rural areas, so it will be able to sustain more than what will be possible otherwise. So these are the type of thinking which has to now come. Our mind has to change, that we have to deal with it, and that is where the solutions will also come on. So that's my view.
That's it. I'll just take Professor Mazumdar first. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
To go back to Pranab's first question,
The microphone.
why does the Lewis model apparently not apply to Indian labor movements? Well, the nature of Indian agriculture is very different from the Caribbean and Latin American plantation labor. So there is very obvious sociological differences. But in particular, even the people who might be expected to move are the landless labor, and among the landless labor, only those who do not have homesteads. Now that's not a very large proportion. If you have a homestead and you have some prospect of income, which may not be as large as some pie in the sky income in the nearest town, you're likely to think twice about moving. Then the other part of the Lewis theory assumed surplus labor as a general condition, which he took from Latin America. Now, surplus labor for Indian agriculture showed that this is not so, that the additional labor can be absorbed and productivity does rise with additional labor income. So that also is an argument against blind application of the Lewis theory to a concept of labor moving. It's essentially sociological factors. And thirdly, even before the Green Revolution, there was some annual increase in agricultural output. And that agricultural output was also reflected in a corresponding increase in non-agricultural employment in villages. So it's not as if they were all floating around with nothing to do except to look for some distant prospect of urban bliss.
Well, let me put it this way. Frankly, unlimited supply of labor is not central to Lewis. Okay? Some form of surplus labor is, and underemployment is a form of surplus labor. And we do know from our own employment-unemployment surveys that the average days of work for males in rural areas is about 210 days. So there is still a fair degree of underemployment in rural India now, not earlier. But having said that, yes, I fully agree with you. I think the sociological conditions are important. And this is not just a question of, Lewis drawing upon the experiences of the Caribbean and Latin America. This has been true also in terms of Industrial Revolution Britain, which had just as feudal a rural economy as we do. So I think the applications of the Lewis model is of much general import than just where he drew his original inspirations from.
Sir, thanks for the great talk, sir. Sir, I will have one, would you agree with this, that it lasts around 10 years? This discouragement to the migration, which is among the policy makers and the bureaucrats there, has reduced. would you, I mean, I'm optimist in the sense that my own understanding is, you look into the politics of the thing, but my own understanding is that large number of people sitting on decision-making process are just not aware of the problem and aware of the magnitude of this, that you said that the productivity rise is much more in the urban area than in the rural area. And therefore, they try to take a commonsensical view that we are bursting from the seam in our urban area, and that's why we must oppose the migration. So it is more because of the ignorance rather than, I think, the political stance. I mean, that's one thing that I say. The second one, that if I say, would you say that to what extent, sir, it is the policy discouraged actually affect migration? I mean, discouragement in policy. Given the Indian stance that, I mean, you can take up residence and occupation anywhere in the country in terms of the Article 19. So policy stance-wise, would you say that only this stance affect till the time that you have not made the proper arrangement for a better landing of the migrant in the city? If that is the proposition, if we agree to that your policy discouragement is leading to this, that despite all your pronouncement in this scheme, you have not been very serious in providing the basic services to the migrant, then I think the question and answers are much simpler, sir. I mean, then the policy stance will be that improve the basic services to the urban poor and to migrant. And that would, I think, sort out the issue.
That is the political resistance. And the answer is quite obvious, isn't it?
So I'm sorry I missed the first 5 minutes, so I
didn't
not
lose anything.
Then okay, but it was a grand tour of the complexities of the issue, and I would say a tour of the horizon, but not quite. So I'm a little, you've given a good description of the complexities. You've called social scientists to arms, and I think those are all very, very well. But now if I try to take a takeaway from this, I'm a little puzzled. One is, it's not really a policy implication, so I'm thinking more that you're calling the implications for research, methodology, and design. So here, I'm not sure that is the focus on migration or urbanization dynamics, because those are two very different topics.
Yeah.
But I would say that in neither case would NSSO and some of that type of data or frames are going to do the job. Because, one is the complexity induced by stepwise migration. And this goes back, I don't go to Lewis, but I go to Harris Todaro. And there you remember when you bring in the stepwise thing, a lot of things change. And the uncertainties, yeah. So, in terms of implication. Then, of course, people like Chinmay Tombe here, who presented here, has given a story. There are lots of geographical variation.
Sure.
Then there is the difference, not just between, you can't even go state by state, because the issue becomes distance to actually the implications of very large metro cities versus medium-sized cities is also different. So my thing is that, and we don't have panels, so I think we really need to think outside the box. Lastly, in terms of the urbanization dynamics, again, I think one needs to look at it. It's not just simple employment creation per se, but though I think it is quite a driver. And then how do you bring in some of the social dynamics? In the past, when we had things like kinship networks, etc., not just in India and elsewhere, things were studied, and but I think we need to bring the employment at the center and somehow figure out how to bring this in. Lastly, what you're suggesting, I go back to the classics of Clifford Geertz, etc., and you needed the anthropologist to really understand how urbanization is taking place in Indonesia or something like that. So,
Or in India.
Or in India.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think there's only one point that I'd like to make, is this is not merely an academic exercise, okay? By and large, I think, again, the work that's been done elsewhere tends to suggest that if you look at migration, a lot of it, other than the wage differential, a lot of it is explained by gravity model type of behavior, which is proximity, right? In India, I think that's going to break down. I don't think the gravity model is going to work, because the number of Biharis who move from rural Bihar to urban Bihar may probably well be less than the number of Biharis moving from Bihar to Karnataka. In which case, we have to rethink the way and go back to the sociology and the social anthropologists or the employment network. Yeah.
somebody in the room who can answer that question precisely, but at this point in time, I'm not willing to do so. Yes, I have.
There's something here as well.
Yes, so I'm going to take questions from the back of the room right now to get people on the microphone before we. No.
Before, yeah.
Sure.
Before, yeah.
So you can do that too. You have a microphone. So is this one is, I don't know where the sign up sheet is, but wherever it is. Yeah. So has it gone round?
Yeah, it has gone round, but I think.
But if anybody hasn't signed it, then maybe they can just pick it up, or maybe just leave it with Kanu so that they can sign it on their way out. We would like you to come back to our workshops. Yes. Go ahead. Okay. All yours.
Thank you so much. I'm Akriti. I'm pursuing my. So I'm looking at urban informality at Delhi School of Economics, and some of the issues that you've mentioned, I've also come across in my field work. So, given the seasonality and reverse migration that you're talking about, number one, the access to documentation and licensing, both with respect to the residences as well as work permits, becomes very shaky then, because there's no, tenure, and there's no permanence in the sense, and that could be another factor related to why family is also not able to come. So how do you look at that? That's one. And secondly, it's a much more broader, larger question when we look at cities and we look at over 70% of workforce in something called the informal sector. So how do you look at productivity as such? So the labor of a rickshaw puller, or say the vendors who are working at subsistence levels. So how do you understand, or the absorption, the argument of the reserve army or surplus labor to be able to be employed in the more productive sector? How do you look at that larger question of what is productive then?
Okay, let me answer the last one, which is, it's very difficult measuring productivity. It's relatively easy measuring wages. Okay? And the assumption is that wages are a reflection of productivity, and it's not a bad assumption, by and large. Even if it's self-employment, you can simply divide by the hours worked and you'll get a measure of wage, which is what the NSS does anyway. So, that in itself, I think it's an easier problem to tackle. As far as your first issue is concerned, the last paragraph of the paper that is available with them essentially says the following. Which is that in India we pride ourselves as having no restrictions in the movement of people. But perhaps the ration card was the single largest barrier to movement, because it was not only a proof of identity, it was a proof of entitlement. Identity, residence, and entitlement. And the ration card was immobile. So perhaps we introduced a huko system before the Chinese even thought of it.
Thank you, Professor Sen, for this very interesting talk. I'm also an economist. I'm working on this issue for some years now. I share your views and question, let's say, 95%. So if you don't mind, I will focus on where I would like to challenge you a bit. You talk on the Lewis model. We could have quote Kuznets and 50 years literature on development economics. Okay. Is what we can call the modern growth theory, and verify empirically in Western countries. The thing is, when I hear you talking, you're still in this modern growth paradigm. I mean, in that sense that you think, if I'm not misunderstanding you, you think that in any case, a country like India has to develop according to that path. The problem is we don't see that path, or like Biswanger said, it's a stunt structural transformation, okay? But anyway, you are still in this modern growth path where people have to move, get out of agriculture and move to urban area in order to improve their labor productivity. And us in the neoclassical theory, there is also this idea of convergence, absolute convergence, which was not in your presentation. Myself, I worked for several years on this issue, and take India as a very interesting example of the problem, the limit of this modern growth paradigm or model. And I think India can, because it's not happening there at a very slow pace, but for good reason, I think it can teach a lot for other countries which may face similar situation in the future, especially Africa, where there will be a booming population. And I have two arguments here, first in the past and first in the future. In the past, first of all, where this structural transformation happened, like it's mostly in OECD and transition country, now we are in what Tim has called a world without farmer, 3% of GDP, 3% of employment. So, but this is an historical path with historical condition. For example, let's remind that from 1850 to 1918, 40 million Western Europeans migrate to the New World, where there was an abundant land there. This, and we know it, especially these days of election or in the US, etc. This large migration are no more possible. Okay, so a country like India, which is in the process of structural transformation, cannot or very hardly export or immigrate outside the country at a huge scale. I've done some calculation, basic calculation. If we think 40 million of Western European, what will be, for example, from 2015 in the same period, so 2015 to 2078, how much people it will be? It's roughly 360 million. Okay, so okay, so this is, and first, secondly, so this migration outside the country is no more possible, or very hardly, and secondly, there is land scarcity, which was not faced by Western countries in the past. I mean, urbanization was not like urbanization today in India. Okay, the density of people was much less, and there was a manufacturing at that time. End of 18th century, beginning of 20th century. So we had an industry able to absorb a huge quantity of labor. But as Rodrigue showed, for example, nowadays there is an unconditional convergence of labor productivity in manufacture. This means that manufacturing is not able to is not so labor intensive as in the past. While it should be much more labor intensive to absorb the millions of farmers in India, China, etc. So this is the second thing. Now, I look at the future, and I will stop there. Let's imagine India is in 2050 in the world of agriculture, where OECD countries are. Let's take 2050, it can be 2100, etc. What will it mean? What will be the condition? I've done some basic simulation, but mathematical simulation. First of all, in 2050, in this world without agriculture, where there is a convergence of income between non-farm and non-farm workers, it means that first condition, there should be a mega urbanization never seen before in humanity. Roughly, it means that 80% of the Indian population in 2050 will have to live in town, which the density should be almost twice the densiest city today in the world. So this is something puzzling. I mean, for the big conclusion is that at least this process will have much more higher cost, financial cost, and human cost than what's happened in the past for OECD countries. The second condition is that labor productivity in industry or non-farm sector should be lower, the growth, than the current trend, to be able to absorb this labor productivity. So all this leads me to question: is India for me, this is quite impossible to follow this model of modern growth, like it will be almost impossible in Africa to follow with the huge burgeoning population in the future. I mean, people who are already born. So, is it not time to invent another growth model? And myself, I have some basic, I would say, and it's coming back to a question raised on the right side. Should we not invent, or India invent, another model of growth, and where agriculture is not only in the primary sector, but also in the tertiary sector, providing especially environmental services, which is not providing today, and which is, and farmer, provided they provide these services, could be also paid for these environmental services, like cleaning water instead of polluting it, storing, sinking carbon instead of emitting large quantity, which is today the case in India, large quantity of greenhouse gases, preserving biodiversity instead of monoculture of wheat and rice and sugarcane, and etc., etc. Yeah, I'm stopped there, sorry.
Well, that is a... Yes, yes, please.
As part of that conversation, to push. No, it's not an attack. It's not an attack. It's just to think of the idea of a new model of growth. The question I had is, does this conversation on urbanization also mean that perhaps we should question ideas that we take as given as development, perhaps even as growth, perhaps urbanization? Should we just take them as given and accept them and work around growth development? Or when we look at those simulations, perhaps think of the validity of ideas of growth and development in this context and the environmental context as well, which we haven't talked as much.
Okay, I think, let me make this as clear as I can. Number one, I am not proposing, both of you, I am not proposing that India should follow the classical development path, all right? The question I'm asking is, why is India not following it? Those are two very different things. I'm not advocating one. I'm saying, why hasn't it happened? Now, the reasons it hasn't happened can either be positive or negative. It is that we as a country, sui generis, we are developing a new paradigm which the rest of the world has never seen. Alternatively, we could be screwing up things big time. Okay? The whole idea of this talk is to ask that question. What has happened in India over the last 40 years, is that desirable? Does that actually give you a new paradigm? If yes, we're good to go. I mean, you can build it into the next 5-year plan or next 7-year plan. If we haven't, 3, 7, and 15. If we haven't, then we have to start thinking anew. And that is really at, I think, the heart of the question, which is trying to raise. That what is a fact is that we have not followed that path. Why we have not followed it and what are the normative consequences of not following it are two different questions altogether. Right? Okay. External migration. I think this is an important point. Yes, external migration, we do not have that prospect. But the fact is that if you look at the population densities in Europe, particularly in the western part of Europe, even after the people had migrated to the US, and you correct for that, the population density levels were still pretty high. Right? Japan, right since the beginning, has had population densities which are quantumly above what we have in India. Yet they have had large migrations, rural to urban migration. So, I think you're making an important point. But again, the historical patterns suggest that may not be a dominant feature. What may indeed be a dominant feature is how well and you are able to extend the productive boundaries of urban areas. That is, you don't have to include them within the urban areas, but can you extend the productive boundaries? Those are models not necessarily of development, but they are models of, what should I say, logistics management in a capitalist economy. And I think that's what one would have to look at, and look at a little bit more carefully. I don't know the answer to that.
I have one behind in this row, one behind there, and one. Jitendra, you have to wait because until we get to the next round of things. So yes, if you can please come up to the microphone, yes. If you don't mind, we'll take two at a time.
Thank you, sir. I am Sagar. I write on, sites, and you have spoken very nicely. But my one question which I want to straight away ask to you, that neither the life from different aspects is neither a static nor homogeneous. It is dynamic and multi-dimensional. But when we see that, the migrants are coming either to the south side or the north side or to Delhi or Mumbai, they should have a model for education. For, as Germans, people are coming in Germany from Syria, they have immense funding to give them a cultural sort of a, skill training. So why can't we have this type of, people who are coming for migration when we have a driver or we depute army people? So we have some sort of skill training, education, and I think the national policy of education is also not tuning to the advancement of the technology or the change of, the world or the activities, where you find that you need to have not that old basic educations, you should have a converging education. What is your point on that?
You talked about different categories or classifications of slums, and it maybe doesn't fall exactly in one of your categories, but I'd like to talk about the slums or poor areas, depending on the definition you take of the criteria you define slums upon. The historical areas, such as Chandni Chowk, for example, the heritage areas, which what we observe in India is the most often are among the poorest areas in the city, whereas at the same time this is the very core of the city where the city developed initially. So I would like to know whether you looked at it or did any research in whether some migration is happening in these areas, and what is the specificity of these areas comparing to other slums. So that's the first part of my question. And the second part deals with identity. When migrants come to the city, can we observe after some time that maybe they start identifying themselves with the city, they feel they belong to the city, and what kind of criteria this sense of belonging would be based upon?
Mm-hmm. Okay. As far as education is concerned, right, I cannot get into the quality of education. Okay, but that is certainly not my competence. We know what the problem is, I think, in a sort of generic sense. But the fact of the matter is there is no difference in the formal curriculum in the rural schools and urban schools. So it's not that we're teaching them something which is different from what is being taught in the urban areas. The question is that whatever is being taught in either area, can that be translated into something which works in real life? But that's a question which is, I think, it cuts across all settled populations and migrant populations. I don't think it makes any difference.
No, but the education in rural and in cities and in convent schools are completely different.
The curriculum is the same. The quality of teaching is different, perhaps, but the curriculum is exactly the same.
No, the textbooks are also different, sir.
But all of them follow whatever is the board recommendation. And each state has a board, and those board recommendations usually followed in rural schools.
The state education and NCRTs are quite different models.
So, Abel, are you saying we take away the rights of the states? Is that what you're saying? No, I'm not saying anything. Oh, you just said it, no? I'm sorry. I mean, perhaps I heard you wrong. Well, there is a difference between a slum and an urban area that has run down. Chandni Chowk was actually at one time the poshest location in Delhi. All right? It has been allowed to run down. But it is not a place where migrants come. Chandni Chowk has a very stable, settled population. This is true of the core of every Indian city. It's probably true of the core of every city in the world. There may be neglect of these areas and they run down, but even today Chandni Chowk or the neighboring areas would not qualify as a slum under our definitions. There are parts of Chandni Chowk which
in this particular instance, as a matter of general fact, the entire Shahjahanabad area is the only slum designated area under the Slum Act of Delhi. Yes. So all the others are like Jhugge-Jhopri colonies which are not quote unquote notified.
Those are not even notified.
Yeah. But they're recognized because the budget structure is pretty. But Shahjahanabad is actually the official slum of Delhi. And all the population of Chandni Chowk should actually be part of the census slum population.
Holy cow. We've got a serious problem here then. And let me tell you why. Because if you go by the definition of a slum, whether you use the census or you use the one that Ministry of Housing uses now. Yeah. Chandni Chowk doesn't meet those criteria at all. Right? Now, the point is, I can notify Vasant Vihar as a slum if I like. I mean, that's entirely up to the municipality. You don't have to follow criteria. So I don't know what's been done, but you are right.
In the 1950s and 60s.
Huh? No, that may have been because you had the resettlement happening. Maybe I don't know what.
Where MCD services are not provided, those are slums.
Sorry.
Where MCD services are not provided, those are slums. The rest are all urban areas, whether they are resettlement colonies.
So maybe on the identity part, if you would like to comment.
Yes, now we have Kim and Mukta, yes.
So I bring you back to your original question. Okay, so I bring you back to your original question of why have people, whether in policy or political life, looked at migration as this negative thing. And I wonder, you did allude to this a bit, but I wonder if you could comment on it. Two things I noticed when you were speaking. Number one is a thread of thought where migrants must come from rural areas to urban areas. So when you're looking at small cities to large cities migration, I wonder if that is captured. And the second is whether the way we construct the collection of data in this country, be it census or NSSO, leads us to think that all migrants in some way, and I'm commenting on the seeming thread of thought, not whether this is fact or not, but leads us to believe in some way that migrants are poor people coming into cities that need services and settle in slums. Because, for example, I give my example, I am a migrant to Delhi, but I would not qualify as somebody needing policy attention. And of course, we can argue whether policy attention on me is required as a migrant or not. But from the point of view of understanding the phenomenon of migration, whether the way that we ask our questions to collect data or of the data that is collected has an impact on how we think of migration.
If we sort of go with the thought that migrants are sort of concentrated in unrecognized slums, that's where we think they are. I'm a little intrigued by the thought that they do not provide rent-seeking opportunities to urban politicians, because I would think that they're at such a vulnerable scale that they would be depending on some sort of patrons and various sort of patronage to get them there, and that would be an ideal rent-seeking opportunity. So your thoughts on that?
Okay. The focus is on rural to urban migration. Yeah. In India, if you look at overall migration, it's actually quite substantial. You have in fact, there is more rural to rural migration than you have rural to urban. And urban to urban migration is almost as large as rural to urban. So you have a lot of people moving back and forth. But, think of the way we usually do in economics, that if it's a transaction within a category, it's not counted. So if you are an urbanite and you're moving to urban area, you're still urban. If you are a ruralite moving to another rural, you're still rural. It's only when you move between two categories that you start getting counted. Wait up. I mean, I haven't finished the argument. All right? Now, why is this important? It's important because when you're talking about urban to urban migration, the migrant is already, I'm again taking a very economic difference, is already in a location where the differences in the wages are not that significant. You're getting a better opportunity, and presumably you're moving from a stable location. This is true in the rural to rural migration as well, although the bulk of rural to rural migration is actually for marriage. It's rural to urban migration where you're really talking about a complete step change in the lifestyle of the person, which is why it is of interest. Right? Now, you're absolutely right that one has to be able to distinguish this, because as I mentioned, that if you look at the expenditure data, depending upon the duration of migration, the new migrants invariably spend significantly above the average. And that's not because of the urban to urban migrant, actually. It's because of the rural to urban migrant, who has to move with capital. You don't have to move with capital. All right. Now, sorry, Mukta, you were on... Yeah, about rent seeking. You see, what happens, unfortunately, with slums, they occupy public lands. Public lands are the single largest source of political funding. And the more public lands get occupied by slums, the lower becomes that opportunity. So you do have a lot of cases where slums have been razed to the ground and that has been sold to a private developer. This happens all the time. Yeah, and that's the rent seeking.
Yes. For his
Thanks. First question is, what actually are is the motivation behind this kind of research? Is it about its impact on the overall growth, or is it related to policies on planning the resources or quality of life of these people specifically?
Well, firstly, let me put it this way. This is not research. Okay? I'm just raising a set of questions, which I have not found an answer to. I'm hoping somebody will research it. The reason I raise these questions is that, as I said, I was the principal strategist of the Planning Commission over 4 5-year plans. So I've planned for 20 years. How you plan a strategy depends largely upon how you sort of define the context on which you're starting, and upon what experience can you draw upon. This is what strategies are all about. And trying to find appropriate fits between the context and the experiences. And here was something which had formed the core of growth and development for a very large number of countries around the world, and I was not being able to shoehorn it into our particular specific experience, which is why these questions cropped up.
Okay. And the second question is related to your discussion about what India has done or has not done up till now, and what probably all countries should do about the structural change required in the economic model of development. Now, the question is, do we really know what should that model look like, or are we still exploring concepts for what we can try?
I think this really goes back to the issue he was raising. What he was raising was a question which is that, yes, this has been the experience of other countries, but the fact is that today India doesn't have this option left open to it. That option is closed, and you have to look for a different model. I think that was essentially the argument you were making, right? So, number one is we have to either validate or invalidate that proposition, whether he's right or wrong. If he is right, then you have to look at the option. All right? What are your options? If I cannot move people to where the activity, economic activity is, then I must move the economic activity out. So it becomes then a decentralized model. Right? Decentralized models have pluses and they have minuses. The big minus is decentralized models are extremely infrastructure and logistics intensive. Much more so than any centralized model. That's all. What is the advantage of a decentralized model? Decentralized model has one huge advantage in labor surplus countries, which is decentralized models cannot take advantage of highly automated production systems. They necessarily have to be more labor intensive. Right? Scales. You've got a plus, you've got a minus. How does it fall is something that has to get worked out.
One more question is related modernization of agriculture. Now, if we invest and actually use a lot of technology.
I'll let Professor Sen take the option on whether or not he wants
Sure.
to.
Sure. Shall I?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So, if we invest more in agriculture from the point of view of technology, then it seems obvious that we'll be putting people out of employment. So, and we don't have any option to absorb them. So, do you think that adoption of technology in Indian agriculture is actually a positive or a negative? And we'll not become more competitive in the global market. I mean, it's not that we'll become the supplier of food to the whole world. I mean, do you really feel that's going to happen?
Do we really have a choice? If people decide they want to move, the Punjabi farmer has decided he's going to go in for mechanization whether you like it or not. I can't quite say you can't. Right? There is a natural barrier. The real question you should be asking is why is Indian agriculture already not more mechanized than it is? That's the question you have to ask. And the answer is very simple. Your average land holding size is too small. Right? Which is again goes back to the same issue of centralized versus decentralized economic activity. One permits greater mechanization, other less, but whether the two then definitionally involve a higher or lower level of technology, that's not obvious. That depends upon the nature of technology development.
Good. I think we are running out of. Professor said two facts, and it's. I'm wondering where you responded to Mukta about when you said migration being largely, as you said, migration for work from rural to urban areas, and in that, as you said, the men are predominant in some sense. But what we also find is when women, a lot of the women do report as moving for marriage, but they also work when they reach destination. And this is not just true for rural areas where it is natural, because cultural traditions in this country, but it's also true for urban areas. And the participation rate of migrant women in the workforce is actually slightly higher than that of non-migrant women in the system. And given the way marriage works, migrant women actually then form a majority of the female workforce in this country. The second is the issue of the slum. And I haven't seen much work on that except for one paper by Chandrasekhar and Abhiru, where they used the slum survey, which also includes a question about families which have moved into that place in the last 365 days. And they found that, if my recollection serves me correctly, about less than 10, I think around 7% was the number of families that moved into that place in the last year or so. Now, I'm not quite sure how you would do stocks and flows on that story, and therefore the numbers that you would get in terms of the stock of migrants in a particular slum. But even when you do now we have now been looking at Delhi quite closely at least, and a number of these quote-unquote what you would, I think, call recognized terms. And recognized to my mind is much more not so much in the official definition as in the minds of people, and in the sense that there are spaces where people feel secure. And those spaces seem to be then be occupied by the same groups of relatively stable populations for large periods of time. And they behave very similar to the ones that you're talking about, which are urban villages, where there is a stable population and there is also a large rental market for people who are coming in and out. So when we look at the options for migrants moving into the system, my own sense is it's not so much that, so from the way I understood what you're saying, a right way to do the Lewis model is that you need to readjust the rural income because it's the upper end of the rural guys who want to move. You need to bring down the urban services because they're not going to be able to get access to the best services, etc. And once you do that, then the gap is somewhat lesser, and therefore you'd expect less migration. But what we actually have is a situation where, in some sense, every rural migrant, in principle, can find an appropriately price-quality spot in the urban area to move to. So when Kim wants to move, she can find a place for herself. And when the temporary mover from Bihar wants to move to a space there, they can find another space for themselves. And that's one of the structure in that. I'm from Jharkhand, so there is no sort of, I take bragging rights. So that's the second kind of, in terms of moving the structure through. And third, I was looking at Ricardo because he's just about finished some very interesting research on gravity models for Indian migration. And what it does turn out, if his numbers are right, is that
the reverse.
No, they're not.
There are no effects.
So there are actually fairly sensible effects.
Okay, they're not.
Yes.
Strong.
Relatively, we are not too far off. Once you sort of control for a variety of things, we're not too far off from a standard numbers that you'd expect in many places.
Look, that's an important finding because it reduces the magnitude of the problem very dramatically. Because then one can actually say something or do something sensible in terms of making these kinds of economic standard of living kind of comparisons. Otherwise, the geographical dimension would simply finish us off. So I'm glad that's coming out well. But as far as the issue of the slum population is concerned, I think one needs to be a little careful, which is The question is that do you have slums where the property rights are already given? Right? And slums where property rights don't exist. They're two very different animals. And I think that is really the crux of the thing. Now, as far as this business of notified slums are concerned, by and large, they are all slums where the property rights are already settled, as far as I've been able to find. Now, most municipalities that I know, when I say recognized slums, that is when my NSS people go there or the census people go there, they are told these are slum areas. They are recognized slums. There is actually a register where these guys keep this information.
So it's not a declaration by...
It is not notified. Because the moment you notify it, there are certain rules, there are laws that apply to the municipality which they have to comply with. Okay? So they So they recognize the slum and then say, we'll provide you services as and when. Unrecognized slums, they won't even look at. So, there's a gradation. So this is something that both the census and the NSS corrects for.
Very limited thinking was that to what extent can we really factor in, you mentioned that they don't bring families and they come alone. So one was, of course, the point that Professor Majumdar had made, which is whether they are landowners or landless people who come. Of course, if they have land, then they would like to kind of go back and not give that up, however small it may be. But to what extent would one, of course, you did mention housing, but along with housing is basically the affordability. Can they afford to bring their family? Which means that you also mentioned whether the wife can work and maybe the children get education. But really, sometimes I wonder whether the affordability is there for these people to really bring their family.
See, that's exactly what I meant by saying that once you recognize the cost of living differences between rural and urban India, migration no longer becomes a 0-1 choice. Okay? So if the cost of living had been exactly the same, the entire family will relocate, or they will not relocate. Right? Moment there's a cost of living difference, then somebody has to take a call on how many of the family will move and how many of the family will stay back for affordability reasons. Right? But it's a little more complicated than that. You can well have a situation, because education is better in urban areas, the husband comes with the eldest son, right? Yeah, so you have to then look at the household in its totality and ask the question, who migrates, who stays back, what is the life cycle of movement, does the man come back, does the wife join him later, what happens to the children? These are questions that become much more fluid than if you go by a simple 0-1 categorization, go, no go.
Interestingly, I don't think we'll be able to find this out from the NSS data, but some of the fieldwork that I've seen indicates that the children are left behind in the rural areas so that they can get a better education.
Yes.
Because the cost of a private, relatively high quality education, especially in somewhat urbanized rural areas, etc., is relatively smaller than accessing the same quality of education in the city, where you'd perforce have to go to the government school. And therefore, to some extent, some of this stuff is driven by the nature of the quality of our public service delivery.
Yes, of course.
And if this is actually the case, the interesting part is you would expect that this is happening because they're quote-unquote preparing the child to enter, to have a more permanent residence in the urban area at at a different part of the labor force hierarchy.
Or his life cycle.
Or his structure. And therefore, in that sense, whereas for this person it is a temporary migration, for the next generation it may actually be an urban transition. So that's a possibility that we might actually have. So, and thank you so much for being so patient. And it's been a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you.